Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
hmm
Today we'll be looking into a really fascinating story that you shared with us. I Am Malala. It's Malala Yousafzai's autobiography, and we're gonna try and peel back the layers of her journey. From growing up in the Swat Valley and then becoming this global symbol for education.
I think it's so interesting how her own personal story kind of intersects with like the bigger picture of Pakistani society
Yeah.
and the rise of extremism.
Right.
It brings up some really good questions about individual voices and the fight for education for girls around the world.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start right at the beginning in the Swat Valley.
Okay.
It's known for being really beautiful and for its Pashtun culture.
Yeah.
But something that people might not know about is Pashtunwali. It's like this code of honor and conduct that's a big part of that culture.
Mm.
And it really values courage and hospitality and revenge. All of those things actually show up in Malala's story.
Yeah, it's like Wally creates this complicated social fabric
Mm.
where tradition and modernity are always bumping into each other.
Right.
Malala's dad, Ziauddin Yousafzai, is a great example of that.
Right.
Like, he's super rooted in Pashtun culture,
Right.
but he's also like this huge advocate for girls getting an education.
Yeah. He even named Malala after Malalai of Maiwand. She was this legendary Pashtun heroine who rallied troops against the British.
Right.
Talk about setting expectations high.
Seriously.
It's like he was kind of setting her up to be a fighter, don't you think?
Totally. I think that name is way more than symbolic.
Right.
It shows what Ziauddin wanted for his daughter and how he was like, I'm not listening to those who think girls should just stay home. Remember, this is a place where family trees often only have men on them.
Yeah.
But Ziauddin very proudly put Malala's name on there.
It sounds like he was challenging those traditional gender roles from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
He even asked his friends to give her gifts when she was born, which is something they usually only do for boys.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
He really worked hard to create a space for her to learn and question things.
And the book does such a great job of describing her childhood.
Yeah.
When she would pretend to be a teacher, or when she wanted her classmates' pencil so badly, or how she just loved being at her dad's school, Kushal school, and learning new things.
It's interesting because those little stories, they show us what it's like to be a kid anywhere.
Right.
But they also highlight how different her upbringing was.
Yeah.
It wasn't just any school. It was a school started by her dad, a man who truly believed that education could change lives, especially for girls.
But then things start to change when the Taliban starts to gain power. It makes you think, how did a group with such extreme views end up in a place known for its beauty and culture?
Yeah, well, it wasn't like they just showed up one day.
Right.
The things that led to it started happening way before they were actually there.
Okay.
Remember that mufti who tried to shut down Ziauddin school? He represents this conservative way of thinking that was already a part of Pakistani society.
So you're saying there was already this tension between people who wanted progress and those who wanted to stick to tradition.
Exactly. And that got even worse because of things happening outside of Pakistan.
Okay.
The book mentions these madrasas that were funded by Saudi Arabia.
Oh, right.
Madrasas are Islamic religious schools.
Okay.
Not all madrasas are the same, but some of them, especially those funded by Saudi Arabia, were really important in spreading this very strict and intolerant version of Islam.
So are you saying that these madrasas were kind of like a training ground for extremism?
In some cases, yes.
Mm-hmm.
They gave poor families a free place for their kids to go to school and live.
Right.
But they also taught these kids a worldview that was against anything they saw as un-Islamic, including girls going to school.
So it sounds like it was a mix of things both inside and outside Pakistan that helped the Taliban gain power.
Exactly. And then there are figures like Maulana Fazlullah. You might have heard of him. He was called the radio mullah.
Oh, yeah.
His radio shows were full of awful things said about girls' education and anything he thought was Western.
I remember that.
He used people's fears and insecurities and made himself seem like a righteous leader, all while spreading hate and fear.
Yeah, I remember reading about how he thought it was okay to bomb schools and even destroy those ancient Buddhist statues.
Right.
It's scary how he twisted religion to make violence and oppression seem okay.
It was smart.
And
He
it's
knew how to use the media to change what people thought.
Right.
His radio shows were like the voice of the Taliban. They reached even the most remote villages and influenced so many people with their twisted version of Islam.
It's during all of this oppression that Malala really starts to become an activist. She starts writing this diary for BBC Urdu and uses the name Gul Makai, and in it she writes about what it's like to live under Taliban rule.
Yeah, those diary entries are really powerful. They give us a look into what life was like under that kind of control. They show us the fear, the restrictions on women, and the slow loss of freedoms that so many people took for granted.
Yeah, I remember one part where she talks about having to wear a burqa, and then she talks about going shopping in this place called the China Bazaar, and how everything felt strange and limited.
Those experiences were her wake-up call to how unfair things were, especially for women.
Right.
But it's even more powerful when you think about the strong, independent women in her own life, like her mom and her grandma.
Right.
They were the opposite of what the Taliban was trying to make women be.
It's like the Taliban wanted to control women while saying they were protecting them.
Exactly.
It's
It's so hypocritical.
Yeah.
And it's in this setting that Malala's own voice emerges, defying the silence they were trying to impose.
Exactly.
Her diary wasn't just her thoughts, it was her way of fighting back. It showed that she was becoming more and more aware of the power of her own words.
And as people read her words, her story starts to spread beyond Swat Valley, reaching a bigger audience.
Right, it's like this huge turning point in her life. She goes from just observing to taking action, from being a witness to becoming a voice for those who couldn't speak up.
It's fascinating how she goes from this young girl writing in secret to appearing on TV and in documentaries,
Right.
bravely speaking up for education, even though it was dangerous.
And the media played a big role in that. They helped spread her message and connect her story to people all over the world.
But even though she's becoming more well-known, Swat Valley is still a very dangerous place. Then a peace deal happens, which gives everyone a little bit of hope. But Malala isn't so sure.
Yeah.
She can tell that it's not going to last. She knows that the Taliban hasn't really changed.
Yeah, she's really smart about understanding the power dynamics at play.
Right.
That peace deal was a complicated thing, with both sides having to make compromises.
Right.
But for Malala, the main problem was still there. The right for girls to get an education was still being threatened.
Right.
And sadly, she was right.
The shooting, it changed everything. And we'll talk more about that and what happened after in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, it's incredible how she goes from writing in her diary to being on the world stage. Her story takes such a dramatic turn, bringing new challenges and possibilities. Yeah, that peace deal was really just like a break, a pause in everything.
Yeah.
But for Malala, that storm came back, and it hit hard on October 9th, 2012.
Yeah, that bus ride home. That's something she did every day. But it turned into a nightmare. It's hard to even imagine what was going through her head when that gunman got on the bus and asked, "Who is Malala?"
It's crazy to think that he would even ask that question.
I know.
It shows just how important Malala had become. Even as a young girl, she was a symbol, a target for people who wanted to silence her. And the fact that they attacked her on a school bus, a place where kids should feel safe, it just shows how cruel they were.
Yeah, the whole world was shocked by what happened. But in the middle of all that horror, I was really struck by how strong Malala was. Even when she was hurt, she was thinking about school and her exams. It's like her desire to learn was even stronger than her fear.
It really shows you how much education meant to her.
It does.
For Malala, it wasn't just about getting a degree or a job.
Yeah.
It was part of her. It was what kept her going. Even when she was facing death, she was holding on to the hope that she could go back to her books.
And her dad's reaction, it must have been so hard for him. But there's this moment where he finds hope in Malala's determination. It's like her strength gave him strength.
Yeah, Ziauddin's role in all of this is so complicated. He was the one who supported her education and her activism. But then he had to deal with the thought that maybe he put her in danger.
Right.
That conflict between being a loving dad and believing in what you're fighting for. It's a powerful part of the story.
It makes you think about what it really means to be brave.
Yeah,
And the sacrifices that families have to make when they stand up for what they believe in.
definitely.
Yeah.
And after the shooting, things just got more intense.
Yeah.
Trying to get Malala the medical care she needed, worrying about more attacks. It shows you how dangerous things were in Pakistan. Even with this national tragedy, the threat of violence was everywhere.
Reading about the medical teams and how they had to work under so much pressure, knowing they could be targets too, it really makes you understand what it's like to live in a place where there's always conflict.
Yeah, and it shows you how limited the healthcare system was in Pakistan back then.
Right.
They didn't have the resources to give Malala the special care she needed.
So that's why she ended up going to Birmingham, England.
Right. But that wasn't an easy decision.
No.
It was the army that decided, not her family. Imagine how hard that must have been for Ziauddin to send his daughter to a foreign country all alone,
Yeah.
not knowing if he would ever see her again. It just shows how desperate things were and how complicated the politics were.
And for Malala, waking up in that hospital bed in Birmingham, not being able to talk to anyone, surrounded by people she didn't know, it must have been so confusing and scary.
On top of her physical injuries, she had to deal with all that emotional trauma,
Yeah.
being away from her family, her culture, everything that was familiar, and then slowly realizing what had happened and knowing she had a long recovery ahead of her.
The book talks about how she had trouble recognizing herself in the mirror and how she had to learn to walk and talk and even smile again.
Right.
And her mom, Torpakai, felt so lost in this new place, not being able to speak the language missing home. Their experiences add a whole other layer to this story.
I think Torpakai's struggles sometimes get forgotten because Malala became so famous.
Yeah, that's true.
But her story is important too. It shows how violence affects entire families, uprooting them and making them adapt to a whole new way of life.
And through it all, the Taliban kept threatening them.
Right.
They weren't going to let Malala speak her mind without a fight. It must have been so stressful for her family.
It shows that even though Malala was getting better, the fight was far from over. The people who wanted to silence her were still out there. And Ziauddin must have felt that weight on his shoulders.
Knowing that his support for Malala's activism might have put his family in danger.
Exactly. That guilt, that feeling of responsibility. It's
Yeah.
something a lot of parents in similar situations have to deal with. But even with all the fear and uncertainty, there's this amazing moment where Malala asks for her school books. Even in the hospital, she's still focused on learning.
It's such a powerful image.
It is.
This young girl who was shot just for wanting an education, still wanting to learn. It's almost like she's refusing to give up.
Definitely. I think it marks a turning point in her story.
Okay.
The attack was horrible, but in the end, it had the opposite effect of what the Taliban wanted. It made Malala's voice even louder. It turned her into a global symbol of resistance.
It really did. It started a movement all over the world for girls' education.
Yeah.
Suddenly, people who had never even heard of Swat Valley were talking about Malala and fighting for her right to go to school.
Right.
And by doing that, they were fighting for all girls who were denied an education.
The amount of support she got was incredible.
It really was.
World leaders spoke out against the attack, and everyday people from all over sent messages of support. It was like the whole world woke up to the injustice that Malala represented.
And then she became the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. That's an incredible honor. It really made her a global icon.
But what's truly amazing is how Malala used her platform. She didn't hide away. She embraced her role as an advocate and used her voice to fight for girls' education everywhere.
She started the Malala Fund.
Yeah.
It's a nonprofit that's working to make sure every girl can get 12 years of free, safe, and quality education. It's like she took this awful experience and turned it into something positive.
And that's what makes her story so inspiring. It's not
Yeah.
just about surviving. It's about the human spirit's ability to overcome hardship and create something good out of something so bad.
It's a call to action. It
Yeah.
reminds us that even when things are really dark, there's always hope, and that everyone has the power to make a difference.
Now, Malala is starting a new chapter in her life. She's dealing with global fame and the challenges of recovery, but she's also still dealing with the effects of the shooting and what it means for her future. And that's what we'll talk about in the last part of our deep dive.
It's amazing to see how she goes from being a victim to a survivor to this global advocate. But it's important to remember that getting better isn't always easy. There are setbacks and emotional scars that stick around even after the physical wounds heal. The book talks about this incident at a mall in Abu Dhabi.
Oh yeah, that part is really powerful.
Yeah.
Malala has a flashback. She thinks that those men are there to shoot her. It just shows you that what happened that day still affects her, even when she's doing normal everyday things.
It makes you realize that even with all the support she has and all the awards she's won, she's still carrying that weight.
Right.
The fear, the feeling of being vulnerable, it never really goes away, does it?
I think it shows how trauma can have a lasting impact. The way it can just pop up out of nowhere, make you feel unsafe and scared. And for Malala, that trauma is connected to who she is and what she's trying to do.
But even when she's afraid and has doubts, she still finds a way to keep going. She reminds herself that she's living her second life, a life dedicated to fighting for what she believes in. It's really inspiring.
Yeah. It shows how strong she is on the inside
Hmm.
and how much she believes in her purpose. She doesn't let fear control her.
Right.
And you can see that same determination in how she thinks about her faith.
Yeah.
The book talks about her trip to Mecca, which brings up a lot of complicated
I
feelings.
thought that was a really interesting part.
Yeah.
She's obviously a very religious Muslim, but
Yeah.
she's also not afraid to criticize what she sees, like the trash, the way it's become so commercialized, and how some people don't seem to respect the holy sites.
Right?
It seems like she's struggling with the difference between how she wants Islam to be and what it's actually like.
It shows that she's willing to question her own beliefs. and to hold even sacred places accountable for living up to the values they're supposed to represent. It reminds us that faith is a personal journey, and that often means dealing with doubts and uncertainty.
And it shows how Malala's understanding of Islam is changing.
Right.
She seems to be embracing an interpretation that focuses on social justice, compassion, and making the world a better place.
Exactly. And that fits perfectly with her activism and her belief that education can make communities stronger and bring peace.
And that's really what Malala's message is all about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Education isn't just about helping one person. It's about creating a fairer world for everyone.
She makes a strong case for investing in girls' education. She brings up studies that show how it can improve health, boost the economy, and even reduce violence. She argues that education isn't a luxury. It's a basic human right that everyone should have. It's crucial for progress and stability.
And she's not afraid to call out leaders for not doing enough, especially in places where there's conflict. It's pretty brave of her to stand up to world leaders like that.
Yeah, that's where her story goes beyond just her personal experience and becomes a call to action.
Right.
She's not just telling her story. She's demanding that leaders take responsibility and do what they're supposed to do.
But even with all the global activism, she still shares these personal moments, like how her mom struggled to adjust to living in Birmingham. It adds another layer to the story. It reminds us that even though she's this international icon, she's still a daughter dealing with family and cultural differences.
Those personal stories make her relatable, even to people who haven't been through the same things.
Right.
They remind us that underneath all the fame and awards, she's still a young woman trying to figure out her place in the world.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Malala's story, what are some key things you think our listeners should think about?
I think her story shows us just how resilient the human spirit can be.
Yeah.
It challenges us to stand up to injustice, to speak out against oppression, and to believe that things can change.
It's a reminder for all of us to look at our own privilege and to use our voices to support those who aren't heard, and to support things that promote education and equality all over the world.
It's also proof of how powerful education can be. Malala's journey shows us that learning isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about developing critical thinking skills, empathy, and the courage to question things that aren't right.
It's a story that stays with you. It's inspiring, challenging, and ultimately full of hope.
Yeah, Malala's story reminds us that even in the darkest times, one voice, one act of courage can spark a movement that changes the world.